Hi, you're here sewing with Cody, and this is going to be a potential new segment. And what it's going to be dealing with is questions that I've gotten about the bernina machines, troubleshooting, whatever, each week. Because I get dozens and dozens of calls each week at the shop with different questions. A lot of times, it's some of the repeat questions just with different customers about different problems they're having with their machine or troubleshooting. And a lot of times, it's some simple things that we can answer over the phone. So I think I'm gonna start a new segment each week or so, going over some of the questions that I get each week. So we'll go and dive into some of those questions that I've gotten this week so far. But once you finish the video, make sure you go and check our merchant shop and see some of the cool things like this t-shirt and some of our mugs and sweatshirts and hoodies that we have on the channel on our merchant shop that you can purchase. They make excellent gifts for yourself or somebody else. And some of the proceeds from those items go and help support this channel. And it helps us bring you guys more fun videos and help you learn more about your machines. All right, so let's talk and take a closer look and see what crazy questions or simple questions that I've gotten this week dealing about our bernina machines. All right. So one of the questions that I've gotten this week with dealing with our bernina machines is skipped stitches. I may have talked about this in previous videos, but skipped stitches sometimes occur while we're sewing. We see it a little more often when we're free motion quilting, but sometimes just regular sewing. And so when I refer to a skip stitch, it's not the machine didn't try and make a stitch, is the needle's coming down and it's doing everything that, or it looks like it's doing everything that it's supposed to do, but what's happening is the upper thread and the bobbin thread aren't looping together to create that stitch. So when you look at your project or your fabric, you'll see some stitching and then you'll see a hole where the needle came down. You may see one, you may see two, you may see half a dozen depending on what the issue is. But you'll just see a thread connecting, say, stitch 2 to stitch 6, but there's no stitches in between. That's what we refer, or at least what I refer to, as a skip stitch. So that issue can be caused by a number of different things. The one thing that people have a tendency to jump to is there's something wrong with the machine. That definitely can be an issue, but that's something that is usually a last resort issue. Like that's the last thing we kind of look at, is that there's something wrong with the machine. And there definitely could be. There could be a timing issue. It could be something off with the machine, but that's usually not the culprit. The first thing when a customer calls and they say they're having skip stitches, one of the first things we tell them to do, of course, whenever you have any issue with your machine, regardless of what it is, the first thing we always say to do is make sure you rethread your entire machine. That means rethread the top and take out your bobbin case, or take out your bobbin case and your bobbin and put it back in your bobbin back in your bobbin case and put it back in your machine. So when we rethread everything, we can check and see if that fixes the issue. And that's the case with a lot of different issues. So always rethread your machine. If that still doesn't work, the next thing, and a leading cause to skip stitches, especially when it's a random stitch, and if it's just one here and then 20 seconds later there's one here, it's just very random, very sporadic. Typically, that is due to a needle issue. Not necessarily use the wrong needle, which can definitely be the case, but it could be just as simple as you have an old needle that needs to be replaced. And the recommended run time for a needle, I read it somewhere, is anywhere between 4 to 8 hours of sewing. It really depends on the size of the needle, the type of metal that's used, and of course the type of fabric that you're sewing with. It can dull that needle quickly, more quickly than others. But so your needle, in my experience, typically is a leading cause of skip stitches. So once you've rethreaded your machine and it's still skipping stitches, try and change to a new needle, especially if that particular needle type and size you've been working with has been just fine and it's just recently causing skip stitches. Change to a new version of that same needle and same size. You don't necessarily have to change to a totally different needle, just put in a new needle. And on a rare occasion, we've had brand new needles that have had faults in them. They haven't been perfect. So just because you put a new needle in doesn't necessarily mean that new needle is perfect. So try another one. Don't discard that newer needle. Just try another needle and see if that fixes your issue. There are some cases in free motion quilting where we're quilting and the stitches are being skipped, and a lot of that's due because we're moving in multiple different directions. The needles aren't crazy about moving in all these different directions. There are some needles that are specifically designed to handle those different directions better than other needles. A quilting needle is much better suited for free motion quilting. Most of the time I'm just using a top stitch needle, usually a size 90-14 for free motion quilting, because as I've said in many other videos, is that top stitch needle, the eyelet where the hole is, where the thread goes through, of a top stitch needle is much longer. It's 2 millimeters long to accommodate thicker, but threads are more easily passed through that eyelet to give you a prettier top stitch, just like the name implies. But also quilting style needles are designed for multiple directions and to help with skip stitches. Another thing, so you've rethreaded the machine, you've changed your needle. The next thing is, once you've done those two things, it still isn't working, make sure your machine is cleaned and make sure it's been oiled, and oil your machine if you haven't recently oiled it. And when I mean recently, I don't mean the other day, I mean 5 minutes ago to 45 minutes ago, somewhere within a recent time frame, because depending on what you're doing, especially how dirty your machine may be, what type of thread you're using, these types of things play a role in how often you need to oil your machine. And every model of bernina sewing machine uses oil in a different manner. Some drink oil a lot, so you really have to keep it lubricated. Some not so much. And different models, because the hook systems have changed over the years, they require different maintenance. But definitely make sure you clean and oil your machine. So you've rethreaded, you've changed needles, you've cleaned and oiled your machine. Another thing to look at, especially if you're doing like quilting, free motion quilting, is make sure your pressure foot pressure, and I've got videos on that as well, make sure that's at least at a normal setting. Especially if you just started free motion quilting and you notice your stitches are skipping, you want to make sure that foot pressure isn't too low, so your foot isn't too high. That's something on the rare side that we encounter, but we've seen all different types of things for skip stitches. Something else, if we are doing free motion quilting and you're finding that you're getting skip stitches, you can also make sure and try and use your straight stitch plate if you have it. Those types of things can help with skip stitches. Also, if you change and increase a needle size, so if you're working with, say, an 80 or a 75, which is a little small if you're quilting, try increasing that size. Try a 90, because a size 90 is my go-to quilting needle, unless, of course, I am quilting on more delicate fabrics. Like batik, something that has a tighter weave, then you may not really want that size 90 needle. Just make sure if you are doing free motion quilting that you're going a little bit slower, because those smaller needles, they're thinner and they wiggle around as you're moving, and it can cause skip stitches, but it can also break your needle. But so those are pretty much the main things that we encounter when we're dealing with skip stitches and things to try, and usually they work. Now, if you've tried all those things and you're still getting skip stitches, it's tough, because depending on what you're doing, depending on your fabric, and of course your thread, make sure you're not using cheap thread, because that's a whole nother situation, whole nother ball game. But if you try all these things, there is that possibility that your machine may have an issue and it may just need to be serviced, especially if it's been a while since you've had your machine serviced. Bernina does recommend that you have your machine serviced about once a year, and what that does, it really helps prevent major issues from happening, but also timing and things get off, especially if you do a lot of sewing on your machine. So keeping your machine well maintenance will really help prevent skip stitches, and a lot of other things from happening, which we'll talk about and we've talked about in other videos. So the other question that I've gotten this week, at least so far, is bobbin sensor. So I'll talk about it and then we'll actually look a little closer at our bobbin sensor. And so the question was, my customer, she was sewing and the screen kept coming up and telling her she was out of bobbin. And she would check and she had a full bobbin. And she couldn't figure out she had a 770 that does have a bobbin sensor. Remember, not all berninas have a bobbin sensor, but hers does. And she would sew a few stitches and then it would stop, saying she was out of bobbin. And this is a very, very rare occurrence when everything is working, when everything is how it's supposed to be. The bernina bobbin sensors on our machines with our big jumbo bobbins, it's very rare that we ever have an issue with the bobbin sensors. These bobbin sensors are extremely accurate. For once, there's redundancy in the sensors. There's actually two sensors. There's one that's regulating how much thread is on the bobbin. Then there's one regulating the movement of our bobbin. And that's what those silver markings on our bobbin come from, and what they're for, is so as that bobbin's moving, those silver marking, or as the machine's sewing, thread's coming off and those silver markings are moving. There's a sensor that's looking at those silver markings. So as soon as that bobbin stops moving but the machine is stitching, it means the last little bit of thread came off the center of our bobbin, if we wound it correctly, and then the machine stops instantly, and it tells you you're out of thread. 9 times out of 10, if everything is in working order and well maintenance, you'll take your bobbin and bobbin case out of your machine and you've got 1.5 to 2.5 inches of thread still left on your bobbin, which is perfect because the machine never stops creating stitches. So especially if we're embroidering, we can easily just start back where we left and we won't have to really go back in our stitches to get back to where we were. The other sensor is actually looking at the little holes on our bobbin. If you notice, there's 4 different holes close to the center, and so the sensor is looking in those holes to the back of the bobbin where there's some silver marking on the inside, and it's checking to see how much thread is on the bobbin itself. So you've got 2 sensors looking. So this is why it's rare that we ever really have an issue with our bobbin sensors, is because we have that redundancy, but also it's just a very, very well designed system. So it's very rare that I hear that someone's having an issue where the machine's telling them they're running out of bobbin and they haven't. The next thing is our bobbin sensor, which we'll actually we'll look closely in a second, is where those little lenses are, where the little eye is looking at the bobbin case, lint can form. So I've had machines that have come in for classes or whatever and their bobbin sensor's going off, but there's still thread on their bobbin. There's a lint covering those sensors, giving a false reading. And that's all it is. It's just the eye can't see the bobbin properly, and it's saying that something's wrong. Basically, it's out of thread. That's its only error message it really can give, is that it is out of thread. But the biggest issue, and what her issue was, is there's absolutely nothing wrong with the machine. It was her door was open. So make sure, if you are having, it's happened to all of us, make sure while you're sewing that you make sure you close the door to your bobbin. Because if that door with the bobbin sensor, because the bobbin sensor is on the door, if that door is open, then it can't see anything. It can't see the bobbin, it can't see the bobbin case moving, nothing. It can't see anything happening, so it thinks it ran out of bobbin, because remember, that's the only error message the machine is able to give. So that was her issue. There was absolutely nothing wrong with the machine. Her lenses, nothing was dirty, is that her bobbin door was open. So if you have an issue with your bobbin sensor giving you false messages, make sure you have your door closed, because the machine will still sew, but if the bobbin sensor is turned on, it will only sew for a few seconds and then stop and tell you that you've run out of bobbin. So let's take a closer look at the bobbin sensor just so you can see what I've been talking about. Okay, so here we are inside, well, here's our door to our machine, and here is our bobbin sensors. So with our 7 series, we actually have a little light that comes out, which is really cool, so we're able to see our bobbin if we're in a darker area, especially if it's inside of our cabinet. But this is where the lenses are. So we have lenses here that are looking at our bobbin and bobbin case, and we have lenses here. Each pair is looking at a different part of the bobbin. Remember, one's looking at the silver markings moving around, and the other one's actually looking through the little holes in our bobbin to see if we have thread on there. So you want to make sure you keep these clean to make sure we're getting accurate readings on our bobbin with our bobbin sensor. All right, so those are two of the main questions that I can remember that I've gotten this week so far. But we'll keep going with different segments to cover some other questions that I get. So hopefully, if you happen to encounter these issues, we'll remember what you saw in my video and help you with your problems. So remember to check the merchant shop. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video. And if you subscribe, you can get notifications of new videos that I post. If you click the little bell in the bottom of the video area, you'll get notifications when I publish new videos. And remember, as always, happy sewing.